Okay, well, let's look in Hebrews chapter 12 today. I felt like reading a few things, and maybe this will go right along with what we've been talking about. In the first verse, Hebrews chapter 12, begins this way. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight, and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and run with patience the race that is set before us. And I'm going to stop right there for just a moment. But you notice that this verse ends with a comma, which means there's more to follow. But before we go on, I think in this first verse, this is the idea that I think generally most people assume what the Christian life is all about. It says, let us lay aside every weight, let us lay aside the sin which doth so easily beset us, and run with patience the race that is set before us. You know, sin we can understand. When it says weight, he doesn't define that, and I guess that could be anything, any kind of problem or trouble or issue or worry or anxiety. But he tells us to lay aside all those things and run with patience the race that is set before us. But if we just read this verse, you notice I pointed out that it ends with a comma, which means there's more to come. If this was our whole world right here, let me just ask you, if you notice, what's missing from this picture? There's no Jesus in this picture, is there? Do you notice that? It's just saying, do these things. Now notice what the next verse tells us how to do everything that this verse says. The next verse begins in verse 2. I'm waiting. Yeah, there you go. Looking unto Jesus. There's the key to this. And I'll go ahead and finish this before I say what I want to say. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. In my Bible, there's a little number 1 by the word author, which says in the margin, beginner, or the beginning. You could say it this way, the beginning and end of our faith. Or the author and finisher is just fine too. That comports and matches with what Paul says about Jesus, that he that began a good work in you will bring it to completion. That's what he says. And this is maybe saying the same thing. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of God. Now, we could read it in one interpretation. We could read it and say that it's saying to look at Jesus as an example. And as I always like to say, Jesus is a great example. He's a perfect example for us. There's nothing wrong with him as an example. And that's one way to look at this. But I think another legitimate way to interpret this verse is to say that the way to run our race, it's a metaphor for our life, the way to lay aside the weights, the way to lay aside the sins that easily beset us, is to look unto Jesus, rather than to all the weights and the sins and the race. To look away from all those things and look instead to Jesus. I think that's a legitimate way to look at this, and that Jesus is the central focus of what we look at, rather than all the other things that trouble us. Now, to show you that, and show you that this is a good way to look at things, I'd like to look at another scripture in John's Gospel, chapter 3. And at first, you're probably going to think, what does this have to do with the one in Hebrews? John's Gospel, chapter 3, Jesus is talking to a man named Nicodemus, who came to Jesus by night, and they have a little conversation about being born again. And then as Jesus is talking to Nicodemus in chapter 3 of John, Jesus says this in verse 14. This is interesting. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Notice in verse 14 he makes a comparison. He said, just like Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Now we know, because we know the rest of the story, Nicodemus maybe didn't understand, but we know from reading the rest of the story that when Jesus said the Son of Man must be lifted up, he's talking about on the cross. He will be lifted up on the cross. And the next verse says, so that whoever believes in him, referring to his work that he did for us in his death on the cross. But why does he compare it in verse 14 to Moses lifting up the serpent in the wilderness? Why does he make that particular comparison? It takes us back to an Old Testament story, and I think I assume that Jesus is, or I think Jesus is assuming that Nicodemus knew the story because he's a ruler of the Jews. He surely knew the Old Testament and knew the Old Testament story, but I'd like for us to read it briefly and see what it's talking about. In Numbers chapter 21 is where this story is found. And I know we're going all over the place here, but we'll we'll just take a look at this. And beginning with verse 4. This is the story about the serpent in the wilderness, and we'll see why Jesus mentioned it to Nicodemus. Numbers chapter 21, beginning with verse 4. This is talking about where we are in the story here, is that the children of Israel have been delivered from bondage in Egypt. They've been brought out of bondage to Pharaoh. They've crossed the Red Sea, and they're in the wilderness. And God didn't bring them out to take them into the wilderness. He didn't bring them out to leave them in the wilderness. He brought them out to bring them to a promised land. A land of promise. You can say it that way. I like to say it that way. A land of promise. Because that makes us understand the analogy that we also live as Christians in a, we might say metaphorically, a land of promise. We live by the promises of God that are in the Word. And He brought them to take them to the land of promise. But in between, they were passing through a wilderness to get to the land of promise. And it says that they got discouraged. Here in verse 4, here's where we are in the story. They journeyed from Mount Hor by way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom, and the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. Okay, we understand they're in a difficult situation, and they got discouraged. And it makes them very human, doesn't it? We can I hope we can identify with that because, let's just be honest. Hello, does that ever happen to us? I think everybody can say that is true in our lives as well. And look at verse 5. The people spoke against God and against Moses. Now I would stop right there and say they must have really been discouraged, And but they're thinking, understand what they're thinking. They're thinking in this tough situation, what's crossing their mind. Well, where's God now? Why is all that? They're getting frustrated and discouraged, and I think it's understandable. This is a very human reaction. They spoke against God and against Moses. Wherefore have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? Well, of course, He didn't bring them to die in the wilderness, but that's how it seemed at the time. And that's a good point, because sometimes the way we feel about things and as it seems at the time is not really the whole picture, right? There's more to it. We can't judge everything by how we feel at the moment, and how circumstances appear at the time. Because if you look at the circumstances at the time, they're out in the wilderness, not much to drink, not much to eat. It doesn't look promising. But God didn't bring them out there to kill them. He brought them out to bring them to the promised land. Just like in our lives, He doesn't bring us. He has a good plan for us, though sometimes from day to day, from time to time, there are trials, there are problems, there are issues. Like Jesus said, as long as you're in the world, there will be pressure and trouble. But see, God is bigger than any pressure or trouble. He's bigger than the wilderness. He's got a better plan for them than that. But they were discouraged. He said, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread, there's no water. Our soul loatheth this light bread. It sort of reminds me of when you go on a long trip with your kids. When are we going to get there? There's nothing to eat and nothing to do. That's kind of how they're being here. Now, I should say that's the general. My kids never do that, do they, Phil? Phil's not going to. No comment from Phil. No, they're usually pretty good. Okay, verse 6. The Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much of the people of Israel died. Now, these fiery serpents, we can understand from the story, from what we just read, came because of what the people had done as a response to what they had done. But nevertheless, there they are, these fiery serpents. And they bit the people, and much of the people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses, and they said, we have sinned. We have spoken against the Lord and against thee. Pray unto the Lord that He may take away the serpents from us. And Moses prayed to the Lord. So sort of like Jonah, who got in the belly of the whale, as we were talking about before, through disobeying God. God wanted him to go to Nineveh. And, I've heard that story all my life about Jonah going to Nineveh, being sent to Nineveh. But I never really appreciated what Nineveh was until I, as an adult began to study history and read about Nineveh. Nineveh was not a little small deal. It was the major capital of the pagan world at that time. And the Assyrians that ruled Nineveh were fierce, warlike, people that you wouldn't want to mess around with. They were serious, no-nonsense fighters. And I can understand a little bit why Jonah was a little bit reluctant to go to these people in Nineveh. But, as you know in the story, he disobeyed God. God wanted him to go to Nineveh. He didn't want to go to Nineveh, so he went the opposite direction, and then he got swallowed by the whale. But, as we said a moment ago, God was able to get him out, even though he was in the belly of the whale, even though it was because of, the result of his mistake. And same thing here. They prayed to the Lord that we've sinned. Pray to the Lord that he may take the serpents away. So